This episode is brought to you by Amazon Prime. From streaming to shopping, Prime helps you get more out of your passions. So whether you're a fan of true crime or prefer a nail-biting novel from time to time, with services like Prime Video, Amazon Music, and fast free delivery, Prime makes it easy to get more out of whatever you're into or getting into. Visit Amazon.com/Prime to learn more.
Change is always happening, but no matter what changes in 5 years, there's one thing that will stay the same: the price of your internet. With the Xfinity 5-year price guarantee, you get 5 years of the most reliable Wi-Fi, with our best equipment included, for a price that stays exactly the same. Restrictions apply. New residential customers only. Taxes and fees extra and subject to change. Most reliable Wi-Fi based on Open Signal Awards USA. Fixed Broadband Experience Report, August 2024.
It is Monday, August 4th, 2025. Welcome back to Hang Up and Listen, the sports podcast here at Slate. Back with you yet again. I'm Alex Kirshner. I'm a contributing writer for Slate, and I co-host Split Zone Duo, a national college football podcast. We have a full and fun show for you this week, or an interesting show. I don't know if it's all fun, but it's a heavy topic to start. The United States has a couple of high-profile international sporting events coming stateside over the next few years. We're going to talk with the sports writer Roger Sherman, a longtime Olympics obsessive, who will join us to talk about how the United States' immigration maneuvering might affect one of those events in particular. ESPN struck a deal with the NFL to give itself access to a bunch of big-time media assets like Red Zone and the NFL Network. It's a massive deal that will subtly, or maybe not subtly, change how we consume the biggest sport in the country. We'll talk about that too. And in baseball, the most catastrophic trade deadline was probably that of the Minnesota Twins, who appear to be not so much trying to win ball games as to slim down for a sale. As usual, joining me this week is Lindsay Gibbs, the publisher of Power Plays, a newsletter that covers the biggest sports of the moment in women's athletics. Lindsay, how are you? How you doing?
I'm doing so good. Trinity Rodman's return has me hyped. So
Stoppage time,
game winner in your first game back from injury after getting a lot of criticism for how you spent your time away from the team when you were rehabbing. I love it.
Did everybody else know about that celeb couple with Ben Shelton? Or was I the last person to learn about that one?
Did you just learn about it this weekend?
We were the two last ones, I think. Yeah.
I think I didn't know about it until like a week or two ago, probably. They look good together.
Yeah, it was heavily featured during like French Open Wimbledon time. So
yeah, it feels like I probably should have picked up on it, but you know.
Also Instagram. You gotta follow the Instagrams. Also, I have not been doing my job. That makes me feel like, honestly, that's on me.
And of course, we've got Ben Lindbergh with us. Ben is a senior editor for The Ringer, co-host of Effectively Wild, a baseball podcast, and not knower of the Trinity Rodman Ben Shelton thing with me. Ben, how are you?
Yeah, we'll have to do a whole segment maybe where Lindsay fills us in on the romantic relationships that we're unaware of. I'm good. I'm feeling good also about my decision not to attend the MLB Speedway Classic at Bristol Motor Speedway this past weekend, which we've talked about the phenomenon of alternate broadcasts, and I've afterballed about the adjacent phenomenon of alternate sites. This was MLB's bid to hold a baseball game at a racing location, and it resulted in a record 91,032 listed fans. I was not one of them, and thus I missed out on extremely obstructed or distant views of a baseball game. I missed out on multiple hours of a rain delay on Saturday, and I missed out on bunless hot dogs and cheeseless nachos because MLB quickly ran out of items at the concession, perhaps because it doesn't have a lot of experience hosting games for quite that many people, perhaps.
Ben, I did see this floating around the internet, a very good point, that there will now be an answer to the trivia question: who is the only player in Major League history to homer in the state of Tennessee?
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's a good one. I hadn't considered that.
I won't spoil the answer for you, but you can go and check the box score of that game because there has now been one hit in the state of Tennessee. Before we get into our business, as always, we do want to say thank you to our Slate Plus members for making Hang Up and Listen possible. Subscribing helps us make this show. It allows you to get it ad-free, which is a delightful perk, and you get bonus segments. And we've got one of those live right now for Slate Plus members. It is a draft of a fictional and a real-life athlete who is out of the game now, but much like Happy Gilmore and Venus Williams recently, has returned to action as the craze around that particular sequel continues to sweep the nation. It's a fun draft. We are going to enjoy it. You can hear that episode right now as long as you are a Slate Plus member. Subscribe by going to Apple Podcasts and clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangupplus to get access wherever you listen. You know the Little League World Series, that great late summer baseball tournament that gets airtime on ESPN and shows the world's finest 10 to 12-year-old ball players duking it out in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. You may not know the closely related Senior League World Series, which takes place around the same time in South Carolina and features slightly older players from 13 to 16, but that tournament was in the news last week because of something the Trump administration did. Specifically, the government denied visas to a team of Venezuelan Little Leaguers who had won a qualifying tournament in Mexico and were due to compete in the Senior League Championship right here in the United States. The White House referred questions about the denial to the State Department, which in turn did not say much. Soon, there will be bigger sporting events in the United States, a World Cup next year, an Olympics in 2028, and last month, the independent sports writer and friend of the show, Roger Sherman, wrote in his newsletter, "There is basically just one thing the Trump regime could do to convince the IOC to strip America of the Olympics, and they keep doing it." Roger, that was before this latest issue with the Venezuelan Little Leaguers, but could you tell us what is that one thing that the Trump people could do that would perhaps endanger something like the Olympics?
Yeah, they keep preventing athletes from participating in sporting events in the United States. Sometimes they are literally children, as in the case with the Senior League World Series. You just mentioned there was also a Cuban Little League softball team that was kept out of the country as part of the travel ban. Sometimes they are some of the best athletes in the world. The number 3 table tennis player in the world, Hugo Calderano, was denied a visa. He's Brazilian. He had recently visited Cuba for a tournament, which is kind of funny. He had just gone there to play table tennis, not like for any political reason, but that triggered something. He wasn't allowed into the country. The Cuban women's volleyball team was denied visas for a tournament in the United States. The Senegalese women's basketball team was denied visas for a training camp. And all of these seem to be linked to the recent Trump travel bans, where he says people from this country are going to be under stricter scrutiny or just not allowed into the country at all. And that's kind of the one thing over the years that the IOC says they're not okay with. They strive for political neutrality, which means we're not going to weigh in on anything, pretty much. But if you interfere with sports, if your government interferes with sports, if you interfere with the travel of athletes, that brings up red flags. That gets them to sanction you. That gets them to potentially strip your country from hosting something. And it just keeps happening over and over again.
It's pretty impossible to predict what Trump will do, but one way you can attempt to is by trying to figure out whether something will benefit him politically or financially or both, as is often the case. So would it be good or bad for Trump if he were to sabotage the Olympics somehow? On the one hand, he likes a good us against the world or US against the world narrative, and he's no friend to the city of Los Angeles or the state of California, of course. So I'm sure there are aspects of taking something away from them that would please him. On the other hand, the Olympics are pretty popular on the whole. So how do you think this would play?
It's tough to tell whether this is a thing where like there's someone at the State Department who's like, we're going to make sure that these athletes don't get into the country, or it's just like one of these random things that gets lost in the bureaucratic files that keeps happening over and over again. But either way, I mean, I think the Trump administration has signaled that they like having big sporting events here. The way they buddied up with FIFA around the recent Club World Cup and next year's bigger FIFA World Cup, like they're signaled very strongly that they like this opportunity to show off what they're doing, sometimes like even show off the negative things they're doing, like show off how aggressive they're going to be towards people coming into the country for games, how willing they are to show that they're going to have Homeland Security and ICE like at these games. That's something they did when the World Cup was here. So I think even though they're broadly signaling against the sort of international order that the Olympics represent, they do want the Olympics to be here so that they can do all these things that show the way they want to run America. And yet this seems to be the one thing they can do to keep that from happening.
Roger, have we seen any proof that the IOC will stand up to this at all? You know, it's no secret that the United States brings a lot of money to the IOC and the Olympics via these broadcast deals and sponsors and everything. And obviously the United States is very important to the Olympics. I have doubt that they will show any backbone here at all. I'd love for you to prove me wrong.
Yes. I mean, like it's honestly stunning when you look at like the IOC's financial numbers, how much of it is just the TV deal they have with NBC. It's like, I think it's like 20% of the total money that they make as an organization is just from NBC. It's huge. They bank on the United States for support, and they've committed to having this event in the United States. It would be truly unprecedented. When I say that they've sanctioned other countries or suspended their Olympic committees in the past, we're not talking about, you know, the United States. We're talking about Kuwait. We're talking about Afghanistan, smaller countries that you could still kind of hold the Olympics without that. The fact that they acted on Russia does kind of make me perk up a little bit, because Russia was similarly a country that the IOC had, you know, partnered with. They hosted the Olympics there, a country that contends for a lot of medals, is a big part of the Olympics. And the fact that the IOC acted in response to their various, you know,
transgressions,
fights with the transgressions, you know, they started a bunch of wars literally during the Olympics. They had the state-sponsored doping thing. The United States, incidentally, also is like trying to pick a fight with the world's anti-doping agency, but that's like another thing that just to keep in the back of your head. It would be unprecedented and wild. I don't think it's like a likely possibility that they strip the Olympics because of what you said. There's so much momentum heading towards Los Angeles, and the United States is just such a critical factor. But they do seem to be going out of their way to irk the IOC, to irk countries that have membership in the IOC. And there's like the potential that if enough heads get turned, something that stands out to me is that the IOC recently elected its first African president, Kirsty Coventry from Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe is one of the countries that Trump has put on the list of like, you're not quite banned from the country, but we're going to put you under heightened scrutiny. I feel like if people from the country of the IOC president have trouble coming in and out of the United States for strictly political reasons, that could be the type of thing that puts the IOC on like heightened alert that maybe something seriously wrong is going on here.
Yeah, even if there are no signs that the IOC is about to join the hashtag resistance, are there any indications that they're going in the other way, which is essentially suck up to Trump, which is one of the more reliable ways to placate him, flattery or something bordering on bribery? So you alluded to FIFA and its president, Gianni Infantino, who's just been really palling around with Trump. They even just opened a New York office in Trump Tower last month, despite already having an office in the country, and seems to be paying off. There's a ton of funding for World Cup security in the recent Trump bill. So are there any indications that the IOC is going to do that, or is it just too soon to say?
Yeah, I think that like there's generally like a reputation that FIFA and IOC both have as sort of like corrupt, money following organizations. But when people say that, like I agree with the general premise, but like FIFA is in its own. FIFA is the LeBron, and like the IOC is like, you know, getting like 8 points a game in the corruption leagues. Like they're not the star of the show. I think it would, they are a little bit less likely to just go all in on like following whatever the Trump administration says. They historically, even when they have like worked with, countries that are dictatorships, or when they're hosting the Olympics in Russia, when they're hosting the Olympics in China, they try to maintain a little bit of like distance. Like they don't literally say, they don't let Donald Trump present the medals. They don't let the government in that much. That's sort of their thing. In the Olympic Charter, it says we're going to follow at all causes Olympic neutrality. I think they allowed typically a head of state to like appear at the opening or the closing ceremonies, but other than that, kind of stay a little bit removed. FIFA really is on its own level of just like, we are going to literally try to prove to this dictator that we love him as much as possible, while the IOC is just like, well, we'll let you host this event, but we're not going to make it the Trump show.
But one way that we have seen the IOC kind of give in to Trump, acquiesce to Trump, is with these trans bans. And recently Trump issued a policy requiring all athletes entering the country to adhere to his anti-trans executive orders. And the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee said that they would make sure that every one of their organizations adheres to that as well. This is all in flux. I guess that's the USOPC, not the IOC. But where do you see the trans sports bans fitting into this picture? And has the IOC shown any willingness to, stand up for the right? Initially its policy has been for each organization to kind of create their own rules.
Yeah, I think the thing that made me curious about this is like, if the IOC and its organizations say, these are our eligibility rules, and then the United States government said, we disagree, we're not going to let athletes participate in these events unless they fit our eligibility rules. It feels like that would be a huge problem for the IOC. That's a line that would be crossed by the US government. And it seems like we are kind of veering in that direction, but at the same time, like, there's a lot of will in the broader international sports movement to make pretty similar anti-trans policies in the same vein of the ones that are trying to be passed in the United States. It feels like the new president, Kirsty Coventry, is like open to not allowing trans women to compete in women's sports. So they're kind of like receptive to that, but just the way that the USA handled it, and the fact that the US Olympic Committee went along so clearly and said, we are doing this because the United States government told us that this was their new policy, that strikes me as something that they should be worried about internationally.
Roger, you sort of alluded to it with FIFA. Gianni Infantino is making efforts to be a friend of Trump. They have him out on the stage to give the Club World Cup trophy to Chelsea. They really flatter him, kind of in a way that we wouldn't expect based on what you're saying from the IOC. But it did make me wonder, assuming that the IOC doesn't go nuclear and threaten to, let alone actually yank the Olympics from the United States, is there, if this behavior were to continue by the government, some sort of half-measure retribution that could be levied by the IOC against Trump? Maybe particularly given his constant need for flattery and his love for sports. And maybe it would really hurt him if he just wasn't allowed to go onto the field before some big track event. I don't know. But I'm curious, short of the big option, if you see any leverage that the IOC has here to try to compel, or at least to punish behavior that it doesn't like.
I think that leverage goes away every day, because once the Olympics happen, there's not a lot they can do in the short term to really change things. It really is this huge logistical event that's so difficult to disrupt. And the thing that made me perk up is like 3 years out, we're having these like sort of flashpoints where it's like, okay, you're doing the thing that the Olympics says you can't do, and they keep doing it over and over again. And like, I don't know what type of sort of like you said, maybe saying, oh, we're not going to allow you in. But typically once you get to the point where the Olympics are happening, it's like the show happens. You know, they've been planning this for 4 years.
Right. I mean, he's going to want to light the torch, like, and he probably will get it.
Yes.
Would be my thought. Like, he is going to try to make this the Donald Trump Olympics. And
I mean, we're talking 2028. There's going to be an election that year. You know, it's like that. Like every chance that he's had, he has inserted himself into those moments, and you can just imagine it being that type of them wanting to put on that show. And it feels like the closer and closer you get to the Olympics, the harder it is to actually change anything about it.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next week, let alone in 2028. But let's say that they don't actually turn away athletes at the border, that maybe there's some kind of Olympic credential that functions as a visa and they let those people in, even if they're excluding other people from the same countries. What is the potential for athletes, individuals, or I guess Olympic teams, national teams, to boycott or protest? Like what have past Olympics taught us about that? You know, all manner of regimes and countries have hosted the Olympics. It's not always the greatest situation from a human rights perspective or democracy or anything else. So like, what does it take for individual athletes to take it upon themselves, given that they get this stage every 4 years, a lot of them, and it's asking a lot to say, oh, sit it out, you know, no show, right?
I mean, well, if you look at Olympic history, the thing that does not happen is the thing that I'm talking about, where they literally say, we are moving the Olympics from Los Angeles to, you know, Tokyo or London or some other city that's hosted recently. That has never happened before. That would be unprecedented. I'm talking about it as if it's a possibility, but it's never happened before. The thing you're talking about, widespread boycotts, happens pretty regularly throughout Olympic history, you know, including the last time the Olympics were in Los Angeles. So that seems like a more plausible outcome, especially if the next 4 years of American international foreign policy are telling large portions of the world, you know, that we don't approve of them.
Yeah. Last one on a slightly lighter note. You are the king of covering every sport somehow, and a specialist in overlooked Olympic sports, which you chronicled when you were my coworker at The Ringer in a daily podcast during the Olympics. So what should we be rooting for if we want the Olympics to actually happen? What is one sport that we should be thinking about now that no one else is thinking about except you, that we can look forward to potentially in 2028, assuming the athletes can actually access this country?
Well, I guess the things that come to mind are the sports. Looking if the LA 2028 Olympics happen, the thing about hosting the Olympics is you get to have a team in every single sport. If you're hosting and you'd like to, you get an automatic entry. So there are a lot of sports like handball or cricket, which will be in the Olympics for the first time in over 100 years, where the United States really shouldn't be able to qualify a team because we're not very good at them. But instead, they'll get an automatic entry to play against like the best teams on earth. So like when I think about what excites me about the actual Olympics in 2028, that's the number one thing, those sports.
The U.S. getting embarrassed one way or another, basically.
Yeah, no matter what.
He is Roger Sherman. You can read him at Read Raj at Roger. That's Roger with a D in the middle of the name. RogerSherman.substack.com. Roger, it is always a pleasure. Thank you for coming on Hang Up and Listen.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, the worldwide leader becomes even more in business with the biggest sports league in the country.
At Sierra, discover great deals on top brand workout gear, like high-quality walking shoes, which might lead to another discovery.
40,000 steps, baby! Who's on top now, Karen?
You've taken the office step challenge a step too far. Don't worry, though. Sierra also has yoga gear. it might be a good place to find your zen. Discover top brands at unexpectedly low prices. Sierra, let's get moving.
On WhatsApp, no one can see or hear your personal messages. Whether it's a voice call, message, or sending a password. To WhatsApp, it's all just this. So whether you're sharing the streaming password in the family chat or trading those late-night voice messages that could basically become a podcast, your personal messages stay between you, your friends, and your family. No one else. Not even us. WhatsApp. Message privately with everyone.
ESPN has for decades had a multifaceted relationship with the NFL and other leagues, paying hundreds of millions of dollars to air the league's games, while also assigning reporters, real journalists, to report objectively on the league and its teams. Reasonable people can have differing views of how well ESPN has worn the hats at the same time of business partner, promoter, and sincere reporter on the NFL. I would argue that the network's critical coverage of the league has severely waned in my lifetime, but I certainly would not argue that it's gone away completely. We had a dogged NFL report from ESPN on this show just last week, and we wouldn't have done that if we didn't think she was doing really good reporting on the league and its players union. It is all probably about to get a bit harder, though, because Andrew Marchand of The Athletic reported last week that the NFL and ESPN, which is owned by Disney, reached a multi-billion-dollar agreement that will give ESPN, quote, access to a series of NFL media assets that you are familiar with, the Red Zone and NFL Network channels, 7 more regular season broadcasts of NFL games on TV, and more, right as ESPN gets set to launch a direct-to-consumer streaming product that will include access to its cable channels, which ESPN Plus does not have. It's not entirely clear if this is a full-on acquisition or some kind of sharing agreement, exactly what the fine print on the agreement's going to say. But Lindsay, do you think the effect on your sports viewing experience will be big, small, or somewhere in the middle?
To be boring, probably somewhere in the middle. I'm very bothered by this. And I think anyone in journalism kind of should be. This merging of media and the sports leagues they cover, we're going to start seeing more of this. I just know it. But this is alarming, mostly because, to me, it includes the NFL getting reportedly up to 10% of equity in ESPN. And that is the part that I just find really scary in terms of, the NFL technically owning a part of ESPN. And what does that mean for the critical coverage that needs to happen? Like you said, it's always hard to dial down one-on-one cause and effect scenarios with these relationships. Often it's a little muddy. There's always kind of plausible deniability about why certain stories aren't pursued and why things are dropped from the production timeline. But look, we're at a place where the NFL has been skating by, and I feel like not getting as much critical attention as it used to. And in society at large, we're seeing the impacts of football, the negative impacts of football, continuing to grow. I mean, just this last week, we saw a really terrifying incident of a gunman attacking NFL or targeting NFL headquarters in Manhattan. Allegedly, I think 4 people died and 1 NFL employee seriously injured. And the gunman it's been reported that the gunman said that he believed he had CTE and that he was mad at the NFL for not, for hiding CTE for as long as it did. And he was trying to get attention to this. And that's obviously a really complicated story to follow because you do not want to give a gunman the attention that they want, but also this is a serious issue. This is the type of thing that deserves serious journalism, critical journalism, and independent journalism. ESPN is the biggest sports journalism outlet there is. And one would have to worry about how the fact that the NFL owns 10% of them would impact said coverage if this happened in the future.
Yeah, I think if the question is how big a difference will this make to our sports consumption, I would guess small, probably at least for the majority of people, because things have kind of been trending in this direction anyway. ESPN still definitely does do a lot of good journalism, but it doesn't really center that journalism or invest as much in it as it once did. You know, there's no Outside the Lines or ESPN the magazine. The Undefeated is still going as Anscape, but there's no Grantland or 538. There have been a lot of departures. It's the network of live sports and Stephen A. and Pat McAfee, and they've really leaned into that aspect of things. And I think this news would probably be a much bigger deal a decade or two ago. It would have been inconceivable at some point in the past for the league and ESPN to get in bed this cozily with each other, but they have been intertwined for decades, as you alluded to in your intro, Alex. I mean, ESPN's been broadcasting NFL games since, I think, 1987, and there have been all sorts of thorny situations. Remember Playmakers, the 2003 TV series? We could have had a future where ESPN was regularly making sports prestige TV content on its own streaming service, maybe. But that series was canceled after one season, despite good reviews, good ratings, basically because the NFL didn't like it. It sort of presented the dark side of professional football, even though it was a fictionalized depiction of professional football. And then Commissioner Paul Tagliabue called Michael Eisner to complain, and the league kept applying pressure. And when ESPN canceled it, they didn't even try to come up with some other explanation. Mark Shapiro, who was the executive VP of ESPN at the time, said, "It's our opinion that we're not in the business of antagonizing our partner, even though we've done it and continued to carry it over the NFL's objections. To bring it back would be rubbing it in our partner's face." So that was more than 20 years ago. So we've been living in this world for a while, but I think there will be some effects. Like, even if there's less journalism, less sort of oppositional speaking truth to power happening, what does remain will almost inevitably be de-emphasized and marginalized, I would think. Like, you'll still have your newsbreakers, but will you have those deeper dives and dirty laundry being aired? Like, as you alluded to, last week we talked to Kaylin Keller about her reporting on the NFLPA. In a world where the ESPN and the NFL are even, where ESPN and the NFL are even more interrelated, what would that look like? I mean, presumably that story would have to have some disclaimer about how the league has a stake in the company. And even if it's the same great reporting by a great reporter, does it look like a hit piece that's been ordered by the league against the union? Like, what's the perception of that? And then what about the great reporting that's been done by others there, like Don Van Natta Jr. and Seth Wickersham on the league and owners and Roger Goodell? Would that be allowed to continue? And even if it were, would a serious reporter really want to stay at ESPN, just given the appearance of a possible conflict of interest?
I have a similar sports labor concern about this that meshes with something that I think has been very noticeable lately from Stephen A. Smith and from Pat McAfee, who are ESPN's biggest brands at this point. I think McAfee in particular is pretty clearly, though he doesn't say it explicitly, politically conservative guy who had Rob Manfred on, the baseball commissioner, right around the time of the All-Star game a couple weeks ago, and basically gave Rob Manfred just what has to be seen by MLB PR as one of the great coups of their time handling Rob Manfred, which was an interview basically saying, you know, Rob, wouldn't it be great if there were a salary cap in Major League Baseball? That was essentially the tenor of the entire interview. And I'm sure that Rob Manfred and his handlers absolutely love this. I'm a bit concerned. I mean, I think you have to have this worry kind of as is, given the financial intertwinement between the network and the league. But it does feel like when your top personalities who go out to tens of millions of people over the course of the year, millions a day, are sort of already doing the bidding of a league office in sports labor, issues. What is that going to look like once there's an equity stake involved? I think that the NFLPA and, to a different extent, really the MLB union and the NBA union and the NHL, I think they should all have this concern, but especially now, given this equity interest, the NFL Players Association should be mega concerned about this because it's already happening even before you have the ownership stake in the equation.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out whether ESPN's coverage can possibly be any more football-centric and NFL-centric than it already is, which might be difficult, but it's just going to be even more of a football news fire hose, one would think, when ESPN has an even greater stake in the league's success. And yeah, I would think from a media perspective, which probably we care about more than the typical person, given that we are media members, there are always these entanglements. I mean, even if you're not doing, let's say, sports betting related content yourself, probably your employer or one of your employers in this kind of gig-based economy has some ties to a sports betting company that kind of props up sports media, or maybe you have some company connection to something else, some other entity that is a rights holder for these leagues. So it's hard to be fully independent and untainted by any connections like that. And I wonder if this does drive away some reporters, whether because they don't want to have this caveat in their stories or because they are actually laid off or rendered redundant or something. And, if the NFL Network essentially merges with ESPN, I would imagine that there might be some layoffs there potentially. It's odd because, as my colleague Brian Curtis has pointed out, NFL Network kind of started ostensibly as a competitor to ESPN, but part of the impetus for founding it is that it made ESPN double down on its own NFL coverage. And so either way, win-win. If people are watching NFL Network, great for the NFL. If people are just watching ESPN, well, that promotes the league as well. But I wonder whether this drives more reporting to be independent, like former prominent ESPNer Pablo Torre and everything that Pablo has done on his podcast and bringing to light things that ESPN has subsequently picked up the ball and reported on, but maybe wasn't driving. And that's a credit to Pablo's reporting, but also just the incentives at stake. So does that mean that everyone just pivots even more to YouTube and Substack and we get away from our news coming from the worldwide leader?
Yeah. And on that note, I think the two biggest things I'm left with besides this equity stake problem are just a reminder of what a behemoth the NFL is. Not that we need continuous reminders, but 6.9 million people watched the Chargers-Lions preseason game that I didn't even know was happening over the weekend. Did not know preseason had begun, and I'm pretty tuned into the sports world. And it was the Hall of Fame game. That's a lot of people. And when you can just casually get that many eyeballs on a completely meaningless game, let's be honest, you have so much power and it just remains. But I'm also really curious about where this offshoot ESPN product where you can bypass a cable subscription and just get access to all the ESPN stuff for like $30 a month or something like that. Really curious to see how that goes because that's something pretty new that we haven't seen. Like you can do a Paramount Plus, but that only gives you access to a few Paramount Plus only shows. A lot of the stuff to get the cable stuff, to get the stuff that's on TV, you still need the cable login. You still need the cable subscription. And that's the same with like ESPN Plus, etc. So we're going to see. I've got my eyes on that, though, and I think we're going to need to come back to that as more becomes available.
It's a huge story. I think it's a huge story, but maybe a less huge story than it will sometimes be covered as. There are people who will say that ESPN offering direct-to-consumer is going to kill the cable bundle and pay television in the United States. I think that's ridiculous. It's never going to not be in decline, but it's also never going to be killed. And, I'm not personally dropping my YouTube TV in order to get this. Some people will. It will be interesting when Disney starts releasing like financial results from this product, which I'm not sure how specific they'll be. It will be interesting to see how it is doing a year, 2 years into this thing for sure.
Yeah, the streaming service is confusingly called just ESPN, so that will be fun to talk about in a kind of HBO Max sort of way, or Max.
Right, you've got to make sure you have to make sure that you know the difference between ESPN, ESPN, ESPN Plus. ESPN Deportes, of course. ESPN Classic, I think, is now going away or is gone. The ESPN app, That's totally separate thing. ESPN.com, you have to really parse sort of what is what here. And I hope that everyone is staying frosty, staying aware, making sure that you don't commit any brand identity breaches in describing these various services.
That plus makes things so much easier. It really makes all the difference. And maybe having Red Zone, maybe that fends off some of the cord cutting, and that strengthens ESPN's case when you're going to the cable providers and everything. And so, hopefully, I'm sure they think that that will enable that part of the business to remain viable for longer. But that's the last thing I wanted to bring up. The last real implication of this, I think, is not so much how we consume sports, but where we consume them and how this might affect them. Because one would think that ESPN, which already has an NFL deal, obviously, but has to have the inside track in future rights negotiations, right? I mean, it's 2029 when the NFL can opt out of its current media rights deals. And the NFL already has Monday Night Football on ESPN and a couple upcoming Super Bowls and everything. So there's already a real relationship there. But one would think that Netflix and Amazon are going to be charging hard. And we've talked about their bids for streaming supremacy. And so what is the NFL going to do in this situation if it has a stake in ESPN? It's not going to want to leave hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue on the table necessarily, but if enriching ESPN really enriches the NFL itself, how can any other provider compete with that? So maybe this helps fend off the streaming bid for market share, or at least, I guess, gives ESPN's streaming service an inside track. It just seems like, how can that not color these sort of existential negotiations? And, as a sports viewer, you're going to be able to find it somewhere on some streaming service. So maybe it doesn't make all that much difference to you. But one would think that this has to be striking some fear into the big tech titans that are trying to move into this space.
I would agree. And up next, we're going to talk about a trade deadline travesty in the Twin Cities.
Eczema isn't always obvious, but it's real. And so is the relief from Ebglyss. After an initial dosing phase, about 4 in 10 people taking Ebglyss achieved itch relief and clear or almost clear skin at 16 weeks. And most of those people maintain skin that's still more clear at 1 year with monthly dosing.
Ebglyss, lebrikizumab LBKZ, a 250 milligram per 2 milliliter injection, is a prescription medicine used to treat adults and children 12 years of age and older who weigh at least 88 pounds or 40 kilograms with moderate to severe eczema, also called atopic dermatitis, that is not well controlled with prescription therapies used on the skin or topicals, or who cannot use topical therapies. Ebglyss can be used with or without topical corticosteroids. Don't use if you're allergic to Ebglyss. Allergic reactions can occur that can be severe. Eye problems can occur. Tell your doctor if you have new or worsening eye problems. You should not receive a live vaccine when treated with Ebglyss. Before starting Ebglyss, tell your doctor if you have a parasitic infection.
Searching for real relief? Ask your doctor about Ebglyss and visit ebglyss.lilly.com or call 1-800-LILY-RX or 1-800-545-5979.
This episode is brought to you by State Farm. Checking off the boxes on your to-do list is a great feeling. And when it comes to checking off coverage, a State Farm agent can help you choose an option that's right for you. Whether you prefer talking in person, on the phone, or using the award-winning app, it's nice knowing you have help finding coverage that best fits your needs. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
The Jack Welch Management Institute at Strayer University helps you go from, I know the way, to I've arrived with our top 10 ranked online MBA. Gain skills you can learn today and apply tomorrow. Get ready to go from make it happen to made it happen and keep striving. Visit strayer.edu/Jack Welch MBA to learn more. Strayer University is certified to operate in Virginia by Chev and has many campuses, including at 2121 15th Street North in Arlington, Virginia.
If you asked me at the beginning of this baseball season what I made of the Minnesota Twins, I would have said, that's a pretty normal baseball team that might win the American League Central, a bad division from which they have made the playoffs 4 times in the past decade. The Twins' postseason odds this year, according to Fangraphs, were 55%. They had a pretty good lineup, headlined by expensive veterans Carlos Correa and Byron Buxton, and a handful of good pitchers, including the fireballing closer Yoan Duran, whose closer entrance video is absolutely box office. This is what it sounds like.
Number 59, Yoan Duran.
problem is that scene was in Philadelphia the other night, not in Minneapolis. There was a great story in The Athletic about how the Twins video people shared it with their Phillies counterparts after Philadelphia picked up Duran at the trade deadline last week. The Twins have had a bad year, but they weren't out of the playoff race, nor did they look entirely hopeless for next year and beyond. But they traded Duran, and they traded 10 other players at the trade deadline, and not for returns that seem likely to bring much major league help in the next year or two. The deals included shipping out Correa to his old team, the Houston Astros, and retaining some salary to do it. This is interesting, and this is a hang up and listen type topic because the Pohlad family that owns the Twins has been angling this year to sell the team. Lord, I look and see what you've done for others, and I hope you will someday do it for me and my compatriots in Pittsburgh. Ben, far be it from me to suggest that a group of capitalists are wrecking a pretty decent baseball team to shed liabilities before a sale, but if the Pohlads were doing that, what would it say about how MLB clubs derive value, or think they do, in 2025?
Yeah, I guess it's the private equityization of sports ownership, that impulse to just strip down expenses and potentially turn a profit before you flip your asset to someone. And if you leave that asset a smoldering ruin, it's not your problem because you got out while the getting was good. And that is sort of what's happening here. And it's been happening for a while, unfortunately, for Twins fans, because the Twins made the playoffs in 2023, and they were a promising team with a pretty good core. And they have just sat on their hands ever since. That offseason, the following trade deadline, the offseason after that. And that inactivity really riled up Twins fans. And now I guess maybe they're looking back fondly at the time when they just didn't do anything, because maybe not doing anything is preferable to doing what they just did, which is really stripping the roster down to its studs, just trading 11 players. I mean, something like 40% of the active roster in the week leading up to the deadline. And that's had a huge effect, not just on the team, but also on the support of the team, understandably, because the Twins haven't given their fans any reason to come out to the park. They're 25th in per game attendance this season, just ahead of your Pirates, actually. And so when you don't invest in your roster, then people don't invest in you. And you would think, like in most businesses, this would be bad for your sales potential. Like, look, I just drove this thing into the ground that I'm trying to sell you. But in baseball, maybe in sports more widely, it seems that if you can just transfer control of a franchise that does not have a lot of existing obligations, and by obligations, I mean good baseball players who have agreed to play for your team for a long time, which you'd think would make the team more attractive and would certainly lead to increased revenue as well as increased expense. But this is the way that it seems to work in sports, certainly in baseball. When someone is weighing whether to sell a team, we've seen this in Washington with the Nationals too, then that team is just sort of in limbo and doesn't do anything until that sale is final.
These stories from how this went down in the Twins organization are just wild. Like, apparently there was a group of players that were kind of gathered together to follow the news, and all of a sudden they all started getting calls that they were the ones being traded. It really just took, it seems, everyone by surprise. To quote catcher Ryan Jeffers, he said, "It's a hard pill to swallow, but maybe a reset was needed. We were curious to see how far the front office would go, and they decided to go really far. The dominoes just kept falling. It just kept coming. It felt like it never ended." Just to be a part of that. I mean, what impact does that have on team morale? They had to call up 8 players from the minor leagues pretty much immediately, same day, to just field a team. What is the vibe in the locker room right now, Ben? And kind of how do you even start to regroup for the rest of the season? Because the manager is saying, oh, we still want to win.
Yeah. I mean, maybe they'll be this year's Detroit Tigers, also in the AL Central, who sold at last year's deadline and then went on this miraculous run to make the playoffs. But I don't think so, because this was much more drastic than what the Tigers did. Obviously, I'm not in that clubhouse, so I can't actually sample the vibe myself, but I think we can infer from a lot of the quotes out there. Now, Byron Buxton, who's kind of the face of the franchise at this point, he said that he wants to stay and he wants to win in Minnesota, and, good for him, I guess. But a lot of others want out, it seems like, if they weren't traded. And there were a few guys who seemed like they might be moved, like Joe Ryan, but ultimately didn't. But in those hectic final few hours, Griffin Jax, who was one of the pitchers traded, he actually requested a trade because he saw which way the winds were blowing and he wanted to flee the sinking ship. And so you can't blame anyone for wanting to get out because they're embarking here seemingly. I mean, they could pay lip service to the idea of contending and you never know, but this seems like more of a full-scale rebuild or something that's going to take years to get back to contention. So a lot of players wouldn't want to stick around for that. And Dan Hayes at The Athletic, who wrote about how this went down, he said that after the trades, Twins owner Joe Pohlad called all of the players traded to thank them for their service, essentially. And one of the players, anonymously quoted by Dan, says he seemed flustered. Him and Derek Falvey, the head of the baseball operations department, seemed very stressed out. And I guess I can imagine why, having to make all those moves in quick succession. So it's frustrating because Falvey put out a statement that said basically like, we want to build a championship caliber club and this one wasn't good enough. And maybe that was true. And generally I am in favor of sort of picking a lane and not ending up in no man's land forever and becoming the Rockies and sort of on the surface attempting to compete, but not really, but not ever really taking a step back or not doing a rebuild. And then you're just mired in mediocrity forever. If you have to just rip the Band-Aid off, okay, fine, and maybe you'll build up and be better in a few years. But the Twins, this was really self-imposed. This was self-inflicted. They could have been better. All they had to do was add to that core that they had developed and spend some money, and they were good. Like, they were right there, and they just did not get over the hump. And so I'm always sort of skeptical when fans look forward to a franchise sale and think, oh, the next owner will be the savior and will deliver us to the promised land. And you never know, right? Because the grass is not actually always greener. And sometimes the next owner, it's the same as the old boss or worse. But in this case, I think as bad as the Pohlads have been, just this absentee ownership, or now worse, just a mid-season fire sale, whoever's next has got to be better than the way that this team is operating right now.
Ben, were there any other Major League Baseball teams that emerged from this trade deadline without a discernible plan, without any reason for short-term or long-term hope that you can identify?
Well, I could yield the floor and cede my time to you if you want to go on a rant about the Pirates for a while, but this was actually a pretty active trade deadline. There was a record number of trades in the last day or two leading up to the deadline. Not that many super consequential moves. There were a lot of relievers traded, as is often the case. And at the deadline these days, you're not usually going to get some huge blockbuster. Teams tend to guard their prospects pretty closely, and it ends up being a lot of rental players who are on expiring contracts that get moved. But I will just give a shout out to the opposite of the Minnesota Twins, maybe the San Diego Padres, and their head baseball ops executive, AJ Preller, is just notorious or famous, infamous, I don't know which it is, you decide, for just being more aggressive than any other team is. And really lived up to that reputation at this deadline by trading a top prospect, Leo DeVries, to the A's for their closer, Mason Miller, and a starter, JP Sears. And then he made several other moves, including for a couple hitters from the Orioles. And so they were the big winners, at least in terms of short-term playoff odds improvement. Long-term, who knows? Maybe those prospects will come back to haunt them, as others that Preller has moved have. But they are kind of the opposite case that everyone is held up as. You don't have to be the Pirates or the Twins. You could be the Padres. And that was in large part because of their late owner, Peter Seidler, who just said, let's go for it. Let's throw caution to the winds. Let's invest in this team and try to bring its first title to San Diego. And, there aren't many other games in town, and so that helps. And then Seidler died, and that has an impact now on the Padres' bottom line. But that has paid some dividends, even as some of those moves haven't worked out and some of the prospects have panned out in other places. The Padres are not a huge market team, and yet they've been consistently in contention for several years now and drawing big crowds. And that's a success, and whether that would entice a potential purchaser of that franchise, maybe not, but it's certainly good for fans.
I do have nothing really to add about the Pittsburgh Pirates. I think I'll spare everyone, but needless to say, not every Major League Baseball team seems to have its eye on any particular North Star other than saving funds for the man who owns the team and cashes revenue sharing checks as he does. But other than that, it's a great situation, and I'm very much enjoying it. We're not done. That is all for this episode, but we also have a special bonus show that is in the podcast feeds right now for our treasured Slate Plus members. As the Happy Gilmore 2 craze continues to sweep the nation, and as Venus Williams shows out in a return to the court in real sports, we're going to hold a special draft in this bonus episode. One real athlete and one fictional athlete that we would like to see return, and who could plausibly still return at this age in the case of the real ones. To hear it, you can subscribe to Slate Plus on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of our show page, or visit slate.com/hangup+ to get access wherever you listen. The episode is available right now, and we will see you there. Our show notes are at slate.com/hangup, and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to follow the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. Today's episode was produced by Kevin Bendis and Paige Osburn. For Ben Lindbergh and Lindsay Gibbs, I'm Alex Kirshner. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.